So I want to kind of caveat what I'm getting ready to say in some illustrations by saying this. The vast majority of encounters that Jill and I and our family have had in the school system have been positive. They've been very positive. I was trained as an educator. Jill was a math teacher. My daughter, Jenna, is a teacher. And so we chose to send our kids through public school primarily because of the services that Jesse, our son with Down syndrome, could get, because Christian schools just tend not to have anything for special education. They just don't. And we aren't, probably says more than you want to know, but like we're not built to be homeschoolers, right? So our children thank us for that. So we've had these overwhelming positive experiences in the school system, except for one place that we lived. And so I want to tell you some stories about how I had to learn and Jill had to learn to advocate and fight for the rights of our children, especially Jesse, to be seen as human with certain rights that he had not only been given by God, but also by the law. And so we had placed Jesse, when he first started going to school, on the school bus, and we placed him in a school all the way across town. Our local elementary school, which was closest to us, had 0 services for kids with special needs, which is against the law, by the way. In fact, the federal law states, the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, it ensures a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment of the school closest to you. That's federal law. I remember when I was serving in southern Indiana, there was an older lady who was 85, 86, who had helped to fight these battles, going and talking to Congress in the 60s, because she had a son with special needs, in order to lay the groundwork for the Individuals with Disability Education Act idea, which is incredibly important for us and our family. But we agreed to allow Jesse to be transferred to the other school as long as they would provide transportation for him. So we put him on the bus, and it was over an hour and a half each way that he was on the bus, hour to hour and a half. So we met with the head of special education, and I laid out my argument for her. I said, listen, Jesse is going to be on the bus going back and forth to school, the equivalent of 3 trips to Alaska during the school year, back and forth. And I never forget, she looked at me and she said, "You did that math?" And I said, "You bet I did. He's my son." So I laid out my argument, and they paid Jill to take him to school. So she was paid to take him to school. This was our introduction into our fight against kind of injustice in the system. The second time I had to go more nuclear. I had to get a little bit louder. So when Jenna and Jackie, Jesse's sisters, the younger sisters, started going to school, the school system said they had to go to the school closest to us. And Jesse had to go all the way across town. I simply asked that our girls would be transferred to the other school since there's no special ed at the school closest to us. And they turned us down, remarkably, even though they were the ones breaking the law. So I wrote 3 letters. I wrote one to the superintendent, I wrote one to the assistant superintendent, and I wrote the third to the head of special education in the area. I hand-delivered them to the offices, and the letter basically said this: tonight there's a school board meeting, and during the public comment section, I will bring up our issue, and if it isn't resolved, I will demand that Jesse returns to the elementary school nearest to us. And I remember the head of special ed, she said to me, "But there's no special education at the school near to you." And I said, "There will be," which is a $1 million decision. So I went to the board meeting that night, and I sat down, and just so you kind of know the environment, so I went to the door, and there were some people there that couldn't get into the school board meeting yet. And there's this guy, I call him a Yahoo, forgive me, but there's this Yahoo standing there with his shirt completely unbuttoned down to his belly button, and he's a mess. And I thought, well, if these are the types of parents that the school board has to deal with, then I feel for the school board. I went and sat down, and to my horror, that guy went and sat in the president's seat of the school board. The meeting started. The assistant superintendent saw me, stood up, called me out, and in the hallway he said to me, "I don't like to be threatened." And I said, "I don't like my son and daughters being separated in school." And he said, "Here's a letter. Your girls can go to any school they want the entire time they're in school." And I said, "Thank you," and walked away. Still to this day, I get worked up inside as I think about the amount of energy that we had to expel just to get the services that our son was legally deserved. And maybe the worst part, and I'm sure this echoes for some of you in the room, the worst part is that we had to advocate for him against people who were in the system and who had the power. And I remember thinking, this is exhausting. And just fighting for him to be seen as human and thinking, how do people who face injustice every day, how are they not angry all the time? Because I was angry just for that little bit. One more story. So the school system made a decision that they were going to combine moderate and severe and profound kids. Now, Jesse is kind of between moderate and mild, and we always told the school system, you can label him what you want. Special ed parents in the room will realize how dangerous that is. You can label him what you want as long as it's never used against us. Okay? So he's labeled moderate, and they were going to combine the moderate kids with severe and profound kids. It's a money-saving thing, which means this. Teachers would have to both deal with feeding tubes and seizures and nonverbal cries, all the while trying to teach the moderate kids how to read. What do you think was going to happen? Both services were going to go down. So the day of the meeting, there was a secret meeting that was only announced to the parents. I sent an email to a friend who happened to be the investigative journalist of the newspaper. So I sent this email to the journalist and just said, hey, there's going to be a meeting of special ed parents and the school system on this day at this time. Bill is his name. You might want to show up. So I go to the meeting, and I didn't say anything to him. I didn't catch his eye. So I'm sitting in the back, and he's sitting in the front. And I will never forget, I get way too much joy in this, forgive me. I'll never forget the assistant superintendent walking out and seeing Bill, and she went, Bill, what are you doing here? And he said, I just heard there's a meeting I might want to write in the paper about. They reversed the decision. They never made the decision to combine mild and moderate and severe and profound so that kids actually got the services they need, because it was going to look really bad for the school system. Now, as I said, the reality is that we have had positive experiences through the school system, but these are just a few of the injustices we have had to face and continue to face in trying to get the minimal legal services that the law actually says he gets to have. And it's minor compared to the injustices that occur all around us, that people face every day. And when we talk about kind of injustice and systemic injustice, it can get so heady and cerebral, but every time, listen, every time there's an injustice rather than justice, someone gets wounded. A soul is wounded. A person's heart is damaged and their sense of self is torn down. And I almost didn't preach this sermon. I thought, let's just end January, and Johnny did such a great job last week, and Pastor Ryan did the week before. I thought, let's just wrap it up. But then I kept coming back to the fact that people face injustices, and they need to know not only are they seen by us, they're seen by the Lord. We're wrapping up this series on soul wounds. And over the past 4 weeks, we've looked at internal injuries that can occur in our lives and how God has a desire to bring healing to those wounds, that you don't have to walk around wounded. He can bring healing. He can take rejection, and it can be overcome by the acceptance of God in our life, abandonment, and overcome by the security the Lord brings. Humiliation and our dignity can be restored, and betrayal. And it can be overcome by the trust that God restores to himself and to other people. So today we're going to look at injustice and how God calls people to be patient and work as we await his justice to make things right. Patient and work. The Bible itself is filled with story after story of injustice and people crying out for justice. Crying out. That's the literal word that's used all throughout the Bible for a soul that is facing abusive actions and unjust power plays where they are crying out to God. The two main words that you see time and time again, Seaka and Zeaka, which you don't need to write that down, but they simply mean cry out to God. The anguished cry of the oppressed, the agonizing plea of the victim for help in some great injustice. So when God is talking to Cain, if you remember, and he's talking about how Cain has killed Abel, his brother, God says this. God says, your brother's blood is se'aka. It is crying out to me from the ground. Even though he's dead, his blood cries out to me. And that's God that says that. I hear the blood crying out in this act of injustice. When Jacob tricked his father Isaac into giving him the firstborn blessing, and then he stole it from Esau, the scripture says that Esau cried out to Isaac, Se'aka. Israel was in Egypt for 400 years in slavery. You cannot understand the God of scriptures without understanding he's the God that hears the slave. God raised up Moses to free his people from slavery, and he had to convince Moses to leave his comfort and do something and act. This is what God did by saying this. The Lord said to Moses in Exodus 3, I have indeed seen the misery of my people of Egypt. I've heard their se'aka. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Why did God act? God acted because in Hebrew his name is El Mishpat, the God of justice. And maybe you have never needed to know his name is El, God, Mishpat, of justice, but you probably will one day, that he is the God that hears the cry of those who cry out for fairness, justice, and help when they are facing injustice and bias against them and suffering. He is the God of justice, and he expects his people to champion justice. In Isaiah chapter 5, the famous vineyard passage where God says, I dreamt up the vineyard, which was his people, and I planted it, and I watered it, and I worked it, and then I showed up and I didn't see good grapes. Listen to what he says about his own people. Isaiah 5:7. God looked for justice, but he saw bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but he heard Ze'ekah from the people that the people of God were oppressing. I looked for justice, but instead I hear the cries of people you're hurting and you're going against. And where God expected to find a just and a fair and a righteous people in his own vineyard, instead he found they were the ones that were causing the bloodshed. Righteous cry of Ze'ekah was heard by God against his own people. Isn't that interesting? And if the people of God oppress, he hears the cry of those we're oppressing. You see, facing injustice, it's got to be one of the most frustrating experiences a human can face. It can cause you to feel helpless and powerless in the face of injustice, where the very people that you thought would defend you and protect you and advocate for you become an obstacle against your rights and happiness. I mean, I learned this tough when I was 17, driving to Missouri once to see my grandmother, and I got pulled over in western Illinois, just before the Missouri border, and I was speeding. I'm sure I was speeding. I don't deny I was speeding. I deserved a ticket, right? State trooper of Illinois pulls me over, and he goes through my car, and he says, you have Michigan plates, we're in Illinois. And he said, if I let you go, we'll never get our ticket money. So you have two choices. I can impound your car, or you can give me $100 for the ticket. I was 17. I don't know how I had $100, but I had $100, and I gave him the $100, and he said, thank you, have a nice day. And I went, I'm not getting a ticket? And he's like, nope. I said, I don't have any paperwork. He said, no, thanks. You can go. So I'm driving, like 2 miles down the road, I'm like, oh, I think I just bought that guy dinner. Like, that was just my introduction. I mean, 2 years later, I was frisked and put in the back of a police car, and I'm not telling that story till later, but I would learn, like, the people, this is not every police officer, you get this, I'm pro first responder, but I learned at 17, wow, I can buy my way out of things, or if I didn't, he was going to use his power against me. And then we face the issues with Jesse. People who face injustice after injustice, the temptation can be this, to become discouraged, perfectionistic, I'll explain that in a minute, or ultimately angry. Discouraged because you don't believe the system will ever change in your favor. Perfectionistic because you realize that you have to be doubly good to get half as far. Some of you will understand that. Like, I had to make sure every argument was in line in that letter I wrote to every one of those people. Imagine what this does to your soul. Wounds that injustice inflicts, where life becomes this fight, and yet it's an unfair fight because the rules are written by people with the power to break them. So you try harder and you work to make a better argument, and you become overly sensitive to any slight. All the while you can get to where you're distrusting anyone in power to decide things over your life. And it can cause you to feel as if you have to beg for grace when grace is free. You're constantly walking this line between advocating for your rights or the rights of your family, while also being seen as a problem for even pointing out the system is rigged against you. Being told you should just be thankful to get the free education that your son, that your taxes paid for your son. He has to go to Alaska back and forth 3 times just to get. Can you feel it? Like you just get ticked off. And that's not good for the soul. It's not. It just causes all kinds of disruption in your life. So what do we do? What do we do about it? Because you're going to face it. Thankfully, the scriptures are filled with people who cried out to God and God answered. James, this is where we're going to be. James, the brother of Jesus, in his little book has some godly advice. In James chapter 5, this is what James wrote. Be patient. You did not want to hear that today. Be patient. Like he sees. Be patient, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. Do you see how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and the spring rains? So you too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble. Don't let that anger live in you. You will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Patient work is the answer for the wounded soul in injustice. Like a farmer who sows, even while waiting for the spring and the autumn rains to come, he can't control the rain, he can't control the ground, but he can still plant seeds. And he can trust, hear this is important, he can trust that the Lord has wired the world in such a way that if you sow seeds, they will grow. As much as God has wired this world for justice, and if you sow seeds of justice and goodness, they will grow. The long arc of God's time is towards justice. Before I expound on what it means to be patient and work, you need to know the context of these verses. And they're tough. I just want to let you know these verses are tough. These verses about being patient, just before this, listen to verses 1 through 6. This is what James writes. Now listen, you rich people. And he's talking about like shark rich people that prey upon those that don't have, right? Weep and wail because of the misery that's coming to you. Your wealth has rotted. He's picturing into the future. Your wealth has rotted. Your moths have eaten your cloths. Your gold and silver are corroded. Anybody see what happened to gold and silver this week? Dropped the highest, the most, like in history, 30% silver drop. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You've hoarded your wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying against you. The cries, the ze'akah in Hebrew, of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You've fattened yourself in the day of slaughter. You've condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. Jesus, too, knew what it's like to end up on the other end of injustice. He should not have died the way he did, except God used it in his plan. And then you have these encouraging words of be patient because of this. Thank goodness these verses are not in the New Testament. That's a joke. They are. This is in the New Testament post the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, right? I imagine some of you have never heard these verses. I've rarely ever heard a pastor preach on these. These are tough. Like, these are confrontative, in your face. God sees those who practice injustice, whether they are withholding a wage or, dare I say this, we have someone on our staff that when he visits Home Depot gets told to go home, and he's an American citizen. What do you do with that? I'll tell you, I'm about ready to burn Home Depot down when I hear that happening. And God hears it. These verses are foundational in discussing anything that has to do with injustice and the encounters that we have. But how do we respond? What they say, what these verses say is God sees. He is El Mishpat, he sees every act of injustice, every withheld wage, every time money gets the way of kindness, every time someone lives in luxury and self-indulgence at the expense of people. He knows what's on the Epstein list. Every power that is misused, he knows it, and he's paying attention. God not only sees, he is judging, and he will judge. The comfort that comes amid injustice is rooted in the fact that God sees it, and he's working to make things right. In the midst of our own confusion about what is just and unjust in our culture right now, do not be mistaken. He's not confused. He knows what's right. He knows what's just. He knows how people should be treated. He knows the laws that are to be obeyed and which ones should be changed. He knows it. The comfort that comes from us is rooted in the God that sees this. And so what do? First, we learn that God sees, God cares, God is working, so you can be patient. Trust him, but still work. I'm not saying sit on your hands and don't do anything. But if you're only relying upon your own work to make things right, you're going to get increasingly angry. But when you know he sees it, and he's working, and you get to work with him, you can patiently, like the farmer, sow for justice, sow for things that are right. The farmer continues to sow seeds while also realizing he has no power to bring the rain. He has no power to cause it to grow. So we wait in patience. What a terrible word, patience. A word that literally means long-suffering, or to suffer a long time, to be of a long spirit and not lose heart. That's what the word patience means. You know, we're told to not pray for patience. That's an old wives' tale. Otherwise, like, bad things will happen. I don't think that's how it works, but, be careful. Who wants more trouble? Patience is the center, it's the core of what it means to walk with the Lord. Patience. Patience is the fruit of the Spirit. It's the center of God's mercy. God is a patient God. There's this great book called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. The Patient Ferment of the Early Church by a man named Alan Creeder. And he makes the argument that it was actually patience that caused the early church to grow. Rome had never seen that kind of patience. That Christians' response to being thrown into the lion's den, which was unjust, it was like we turned the other cheek, and Rome had never seen it. This is what he wrote. He wrote, Christians were growing in numbers because they were distinct from the unjust, living patiently in relation to their neighbors and enemies, doing good to them and waiting for them to come to faith. Origen, one of the early church fathers, wrote, For you who are redeemed by Christ, a physical sword has been removed from your hands. Don't miss that line. Now that you're a Christian, a physical sword has been removed from your hands. But this did not mean that you're powerless. For in its place, the sword of the Spirit has been given, and you must seize it. Christians fight by means of prayers and fast and justice and piety and gentleness and chastity and all the virtues of self-control. And the result, one saint who prays is much more powerful than countless sinners who wage war. I wonder if you believe that. So pray and live faithfully. Origen urged the Caesarean believers, if you wish to prevail, lift up your hands and your deeds. Deeply rooted in God's own patience, we learn to be patient and wait for God to act and do acts of justice to make things right as we wait for him. In fact, I want to look at Romans 16, verse 20. One of the verses in Romans that is just really confusing to me when you look at it, because it bluntly says this, so the God of peace will soon beat up Satan. It's an amazing juxtaposition. The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. So be patient and work, for God is at work. and he sees. You know, like this Wednesday is Rosa Parks Day. You may not know that, but it is. And every time I visit the bus at Henry Ford Museum in Detroit, in Dearborn, I sit there in that seat and I think, what would I do? What would I have done? If just because of how I look, how God crafted me and with his beautiful hands, I was told I have to get to the back of the bus. You know, I don't think Rosa meant to start like some movement. I think she was just tired. I'm just tired of having to be told what to do. But God used it. He used her just tiredness, and it changed our culture. Those of you that are on the other end, having received injustice in your life, and you know, this has been a tough series. I mean, we've talked about some heavy things. In fact, it's really good we're going to end with communion, which we're getting ready to move toward. But I wanted to give you a resource. This is from Wild at Heart, a ministry. This is actually under resources on our new Church Center app as well. But if you go to Wild at Heart or you use that QR code, it'll take you to a prayer that you can walk through yourself or with other people. And there's an audio section which just takes you to those hurt points in your life, the humiliation, you know, the rejection, the things that you've faced that have maybe been brought up in these last couple of weeks. And it allows the Spirit of God to bring healing into those. Because God wants to heal. He doesn't want you angry. He doesn't want those who are practicing injustice against you to live in your head. They don't have to live there as you're connected to Him.